The thing about civilized space, and here we must use the term civilized, with all the generous flexibility it deserves, is that everyone has cameras. Everywhere. All the time. The galactic community, in its infinite wisdom and paranoia, decided approximately 3,000 years ago that the best way to prevent interspecies incidents was to record absolutely everything. Court disputes, check the footage, diplomatic misunderstandings, review the tapes. Someone claimed your restaurant's Glorbinax paste gave them intestinal crystallization. Well, there's 17 angles of you eating it first to prove it was fine, probably. This obsession with documentation reached truly artistic heights in educational institutions, where the liability concerns mixed beautifully with academic bureaucracy to create a surveillance state that would make any self-respecting authoritarian weep with envy. The Velcrian Academy of Integrated Sciences, stationed on the peaceful garden world of Velcros Prime, had taken this philosophy and elevated it to religious doctrine. 463 cameras covered every square meter of campus. Thermal imaging, motion sensors, atmospheric analyzers, even pheromone detectors for those species that communicated through scent. If a student sneezed in Lecture Hall 7, the administration could tell you the particulate composition, trajectory, and whether it violated any of the 68 relevant health codes. The Academy prided itself on safety. Velcrians, as a species, had evolved on a world so docile that their apex predator was essentially a very ambitious mushroom that sometimes fell on smaller mushrooms. They had no concept of actual danger, which paradoxically made them obsessed with theoretical danger. Their risk assessment documents had risk assessment documents. Their emergency protocols had emergency protocols for the emergency protocols. When they joined the galactic community and discovered that the universe contained things like venomous fauna, carnivorous plants, and planets where the weather could actually kill you, they collectively decided that the only rational response was to catalog every possible threat and then hide from all of them. Which is why the Interspecies Educational Exchange Program was such a deliciously ironic disaster waiting to happen. The program, designed to foster understanding between species and definitely not to produce surveillance footage for cheap entertainment channels, placed students from various worlds into academic institutions across the galaxy. The Velcrian Academy, desperate to appear cosmopolitan despite being staffed entirely by people who thought a paper cut was a medical emergency, had eagerly signed up. They got a nice Zenthari student who photosynthesized quietly in the corner, a Milvaxian whose most aggressive trait was passive-aggressive note-taking, even a Kixian, and those folks were made of crystals that could theoretically shatter. But mostly they just refracted light prettily and got excellent grades in mathematics. And then there was the human. Professor Thin, and yes, that was unfortunately his actual name, leading to countless jokes about his equally thin patience and even thinner nerve, stood at the front of Xenobiology 301, trying to project an air of academic authority while his three eye stalks twitched with barely suppressed anxiety. The morning lecture on comparative respiratory systems had gone well. Nobody had fainted. No equipment had exploded. The human had even participated appropriately, raising her hand to ask questions instead of just blurting them out like some kind of barbarian. Things were fine. Everything was fine. Thin really should have known better than to think things were fine. The human, whose name was decidedly not any of the boring ones usually assigned to her species in poorly researched fiction, sat in the third row, taking notes on a primitive paper notebook because apparently her species still enjoyed killing plant matter to record information. She looked harmless enough. Bilateral symmetry, forward-facing eyes, that odd combination of vulnerability and sturdiness that characterized Deathworld species. She wore the standard academy uniform, modified for her specific atmospheric and temperature requirements, and smiled at her classmates with those disturbing bone protrusions that humans insisted were friendly expressions. The other students had learned to tolerate her presence, though several still filed daily reports expressing concern about sharing space with an apex predator species. The Valkyrians in the class submitted their reports in triplicate, with footnotes and appendices. Today's practical demonstration involved comparative analysis of various species' pain responses and healing factors. A delightfully safe and controlled exercise that absolutely nothing could possibly go wrong with. Thin had prepared for weeks, checking every piece of equipment, running 17 safety drills, and submitting the required 412 pages of documentation to the safety committee. Everything was in order. The cameras were recording at maximum resolution, as always. The emergency medical team was on standby. The liability waivers were signed, countersigned, and notarized by 3 separate authorities. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of humor. The first sign of trouble came from the specimen containment unit, which housed a relatively harmless Deltarian pain sensor organism, essentially a biological demonstration tool that could simulate injury responses without actual harm. Incredibly safe, totally foolproof, approved for educational use by 6 different regulatory bodies. The kind of organism that made Valkyrians feel brave for being in the same room with it. The second sign of trouble was the soft popping sound it made before the containment unit's temperature regulation system decided that today was an excellent day to catastrophically fail. Thin's primary eye stalk swiveled toward the unit just in time to see the temperature display spike from a comfortable 287 Kelvin to a decidedly uncomfortable 340 Kelvin in approximately 3 seconds. The Deltarian organism, which had evolved in cool, stable environments and had the survival instincts of a particularly naive breakfast pastry, immediately began expressing its distress through the only method it knew: releasing massive quantities of caustic defense pheromones that could induce temporary paralysis and extreme pain responses in most oxygen-breathing species. The classroom erupted into the kind of organized panic that only truly safe species can achieve. The Zenthari student immediately withdrew all exposed photosynthetic membranes and curled into a protective ball, which was their solution to everything from loud noises to surprise quizzes. The Malfunctioned began reciting emergency protocols in alphabetical order because apparently that was helpful. The Kixian student's crystalline structure started resonating at a frequency that indicated severe distress, and also shattered 3 nearby glass beakers. Thin, to his credit, managed to activate the emergency containment protocols before his secondary eye stalk fainted, which was a real thing that could happen to Valkyrians under stress. The problem was that emergency containment protocols were designed for slow, methodical shutdown procedures. They were not designed for situations where a specimen was actively melting down and flooding the room with chemical weapons. The caustic pheromones hit the ventilation system, which dutifully distributed them throughout the classroom in the name of proper air circulation. The automated safety systems, detecting a potential hazard, immediately sealed all exits to prevent contamination spread, which was exactly the right protocol if your goal was to trap everyone inside with the problem. The cameras, all 463 of them, continued recording at maximum resolution because apparently the one thing that should keep working during an emergency was the surveillance equipment. Students began dropping like Valkyrian eye stalks at a surprise party. Not dying, the pheromones weren't lethal, just absolutely miserable, but experiencing the kind of full-body pain response that made them very much wish that they could die. The Malfunctioned stopped reciting protocols and started reciting what sounded like prayers. The Zenthari's protective ball somehow curled tighter, Even Professor Thin collapsed against his desk, all three eye stalks now thoroughly unconscious and leaving his main consciousness to deal with the sensation of being simultaneously burned, frozen, and digested. The human stood up. Now, here's where the cameras really earned their maintenance budget. From 17 different angles, in multiple spectrums, with audio and atmospheric analysis, they captured what happened next, with the kind of detail that would later make Galactic Education Board reviewers require mandatory therapy sessions. While every other species in the room was experiencing their pain receptors' full creative potential, the human just looked annoyed. Not agonized, not paralyzed, annoyed. Like someone had interrupted her during an interesting lecture, which, technically, the melting specimen had. She moved toward the failing containment unit with the kind of purposeful stride that species develop when their homeworld has actual predators. Her forward-facing eyes, those terrifying markers of a hunter species, locked onto the problem with the focus of something that had evolved to chase down prey across vast distances. The cameras caught her lips pulling back slightly, revealing those bone protrusions in what database analysis later confirmed was not a friendly expression at all, but rather the facial configuration humans made before doing something inadvisable. The containment unit was now hot enough to make the air shimmer. The Deltarian organism was thoroughly committed to its meltdown, releasing pheromones at concentrations that should have rendered any carbon-based life form completely incapacitated. The human reached for it anyway. What happened next took approximately 4 seconds, which the cameras dutifully recorded in excruciating detail. The human grabbed a laboratory coat, thick synthetic fibers designed to protect against minor chemical splashes, and wrapped it around her hands. Then she simply opened the containment unit's manual override, reached in past the caustic pheromone cloud that was dissolving the unit's interior lining, grabbed the specimen container, and yanked it out. The temperature was sufficient to cause second-degree burns on most species' manipulator appendages. The human's face twitched slightly, which the cameras caught, but which she apparently considered an acceptable trade-off for removing the problem. She carried the container to the emergency chemical waste disposal unit, walking, not running, because apparently pain wasn't a sufficient motivation to increase her pace, and dumped it inside. Then she activated the flash freeze protocol, which was designed for disposing of dangerous chemical reactions and definitely not for calming down distressed specimens, but which worked anyway because the universe occasionally rewarded stupid solutions. The pheromone release stopped. The temperature began dropping. The atmospheric analyzers detected rapidly decreasing concentrations of caustic compounds. The human stood there for a moment, looking at her hands, which the thermal cameras revealed were definitely burned. Then looked around at her classmates with an expression that could only be described as confused concern. Then she started helping people. The cameras captured all of it. The human moving from student to student, checking for responses, moving unconscious bodies into recovery positions that her species had apparently developed extensive protocols for, speaking in that soft tone that humans used when trying not to frighten prey animals, which was deeply ironic given the circumstances. She dragged Professor Thin to a better location, propped up his unconscious eye stalks so they wouldn't get damaged, and even managed to figure out which emergency protocols to activate to start proper ventilation. By the time the emergency medical team arrived, approximately 6 minutes after the initial alert, which was actually excellent response time but felt like hours to those conscious enough to experience it, the human had stabilized the situation. She'd stopped the source, cleared the worst of the contamination, and organized the victims by severity of exposure. She'd done this while experiencing pain levels that should have incapacitated her, while breathing air that still contained enough caustic compounds to make each breath an adventure in creative suffering, while her hands were literally burned. When the medical team burst through the newly unsealed doors, they found a classroom of traumatized students and unconscious faculty, one destroyed specimen, and a human sitting calmly on a desk. Her hands wrapped in torn pieces of her own clothing, looking like someone who just finished a mildly inconvenient task. "I think the temperature regulator failed," she said helpfully, as if that explained everything. The head of the medical team, a Valkyrian with enough emergency response experience to have developed the species equivalent of shell shock, stared at her for a long moment. Then at the carnage around the room. Then back at her. Then at his scanner, which was insisting that the human's pain receptor activity was somewhere in the range usually associated with major trauma surgery, without anesthesia. "You should be unconscious," he said finally. The human shrugged, which made several of the conscious students whimper, because the movement revealed the extent of her burns. "It hurts, but I've had worse. Do you have anything for everyone else? They look pretty rough." This, the cameras caught from multiple angles. The human's vital signs showing severe stress and pain. Her hands showing tissue damage that would require weeks of healing for most species. Her respiratory system processing air that was still borderline toxic. And her facial expression showing mild concern, primarily for other people. The medical team began triage, working with the efficient panic of people who'd trained for disasters, but never expected to encounter actual Deathworld-level responses. They treated the other students first, because those cases were straightforward. Exposure to caustic compounds, standard pain management, routine recovery protocols. The human they saved for last, partly because she kept insisting she was fine, and partly because none of them wanted to confront what their scanners were telling them about her pain tolerance. When they finally got her to medical, the duty physician took one look at the readings and requested a psychiatric evaluation because clearly the scanners were malfunctioning. Except they weren't. The human really was just operating normally while experiencing pain that would have sent any Valkyrian into shock-induced shutdown. She answered questions politely. She apologized for bleeding on the examination table. She even asked if the specimen had survived, which suggested her priorities were entertainingly skewed. The cameras in medical captured all of this too, because of course they did. The human's treatment, her vital signs, her continued insistence that this really wasn't that bad, compared to something called a camping trip gone wrong, which apparently was a recreational activity her species engaged in voluntarily. And that's when the Academy administration began reviewing the footage. The Administrative Council of Valkyrian Academy met in their secure conference room, which was equipped with enough cameras to record a meeting about cameras recording things, because irony was apparently dead, and Valkyrians had killed it. The council consisted of Dean Vorex, a Valkyrian so old his eye stalks had developed a permanent nervous tremor. Assistant Dean Killeth, who handled student affairs and was currently handling them very poorly. Security Director Than, whose job was supposed to be easy on a safe campus. And Legal Advisor Prin, who looked like someone had just told him his malpractice insurance premiums were about to get interesting. They watched the footage, all of it, from 17 angles, in multiple spectrums. With audio commentary from the atmospheric analyzers, helpfully noting when air quality reached moderately lethal levels. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that occurs when people are trying to figure out which aspect of a disaster to panic about first. "So," Dean Vorex said finally, his voice very carefully controlled. "To summarize, we had a containment failure that exposed students to caustic compounds. Standard emergency situation, unfortunate but manageable. And then the human." He trailed off, gesturing vaguely at the frozen image on the screen, showing the human grabbing the specimen container, with her bare hands. "Fixed it," Assistant Dean Killeth finished weakly. While experiencing pain levels that should have been physiologically impossible to function through, Security Director Than added, consulting his datapad. The medical team's report indicates she was operating at approximately 40% of her species' pain threshold before losing consciousness. 40%. The specimen exposure would have registered at least 70 to 80% for most species. She treated it like an inconvenience. Legal advisor Prin made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. "Do you understand what this means? We have a student, a registered student, enrolled through official channels with proper documentation, who can function through pain that would incapacitate our entire species. We exposed her to a hazardous situation. She resolved it, using methods that our safety protocols explicitly prohibit because they require tolerating harmful conditions. And we recorded all of it." "Well, yes," Dean Vorex said. "The cameras always record. That's the policy." "That's the problem," Prin said. "We have definitive evidence that our safety protocols are insufficient for Deathworld species. We have evidence that a human can and will perform actions that violate multiple safety regulations when circumstances require it. We have evidence that our containment systems can fail catastrophically. And we have all of this in high-definition, multi-spectrum, legally admissible format." The council stared at the screens, showing the human's actions from multiple angles. The moment she grabbed the container, the thermal imaging showing the heat transfer, the chemical analysis showing the pheromone concentrations, the medical scans showing her pain levels, all of it, recorded with the obsessive thoroughness that was supposed to protect the Academy from liability. "If the Galactic Education Board sees this," Assistant Dean Killeth said slowly, "they'll require a complete overhaul of our Deathworld species protocols. Do you know how expensive that is? Do you know how much documentation that requires? We'd need new equipment rated for species that can tolerate harmful conditions. We'd need new safety procedures that account for students who might ignore pain signals. We'd need new liability waivers that somehow explain that we can't actually stop humans from doing inadvisable things when they decide it's necessary. We'd need new cameras," Security Director Than said mournfully. Everyone looked at him. "The current system isn't rated for Deathworld environmental conditions," he explained. "If we're acknowledging that humans might create or operate in hazardous environments, we need equipment that can continue recording in those conditions. Some of the footage degraded when the temperature spiked. That's unacceptable from a documentation standpoint." Legal advisor Prin's eye stalks drooped in what might have been defeat or possibly despair. "So our options are: submit the footage to the board, trigger a complete system overhaul, spend millions of credits, drown in documentation, and probably end up as a case study in how not to handle Deathworld species integration. Or, the word hung in the air like the caustic pheromones had hung in the classroom, except more dangerous and with more severe long-term consequences. Or, Dean Vorex said carefully, we acknowledge that we experienced a technical malfunction. The footage degraded. The equipment failed during the emergency, which is why we're definitely investing in better systems. We have the medical reports, which show everyone received appropriate care. We have witness testimony, which confirms a containment breach was resolved. We just don't have complete camera footage of the resolution process. The cameras, Assistant Dean Killeth said slowly, malfunctioned. During an emergency situation involving temperature spikes and caustic compounds, Security Director Than added. Completely understandable. Equipment failure happens. We'll file the appropriate reports, recommend upgrades. Submit for budget increases. All very proper and documented. And the human? Prin asked. They pulled up her medical report. Second-degree burns on both hands. Treated and healing well with human standard protocols. Minor respiratory irritation from compound exposure, resolved without intervention. Psychological evaluation. Normal for species, showing appropriate concern for others and remarkable composure under stress, which was apparently standard for Deathworlders and not at all terrifying if you didn't think about it too hard. Received excellent medical care, Dean Vorik said. Demonstrated admirable composure during a crisis. Helped fellow students. Should probably receive a commendation for her actions, which we would be happy to provide. Based entirely on witness testimony and partial footage, without going into excessive detail about what those actions specifically were. The council sat in silence for a moment, contemplating what they were about to do. Then, as one, they turned to look at the complete, high-definition, multi-spectrum footage that clearly showed every detail of the human's inadvisable heroics. Security Director Than reached for the controls. Such a shame about the equipment failure. Really must invest in better systems. For documentation purposes, of course. Of course, the others echoed. The footage was transferred to a secure archive, classified under Equipment Malfunction Analysis, restricted access only. The official incident report documented a containment breach, emergency response, successful resolution, and unfortunate camera failure during the critical moments. All very proper, all very documented, all very carefully avoiding the part where a human had operated through conditions that should have been incapacitating while every other species present had dropped like fainting eye stalks. The report to the Galactic Education Board was thorough, professional, and creative in its interpretation of complete documentation. Yes, there was an incident. Yes, everyone was treated appropriately. Yes, equipment upgrades were being pursued. The degraded footage was included as evidence of why those upgrades were necessary. Very concerning, much safety. Wow, documentation. The board accepted the report with the kind of board efficiency that suggested they received hundreds of similar incident reports daily. Equipment malfunctions happened. Velcrions were always requesting safety upgrades. This was all very normal. Case closed. Professor Thin returned to teaching 3 days later, all eye stalks functional, but with a new nervous twitch that activated whenever he looked at the human student. She continued. Attending class, taking notes on her barbaric paper notebook, asking intelligent questions, and being generally normal in ways that now seemed profoundly abnormal once you'd seen her grab a container of melting caustic specimen with her bare hands. The other students treated her with new wariness, the kind that species develop around apex predators they can't escape from. Polite, but careful. Friendly, but never forgetting what she was. The human seemed oblivious to this shift, or possibly was politely ignoring it, which was somehow worse because it suggested social awareness sophisticated enough to recognize fear and choose not to acknowledge it. The Academy installed new cameras, better ones, rated for a wider range of environmental conditions. Security Director Than submitted a proposal for thermal shielding and chemical resistance, because apparently documentation was important enough to require recording equipment that could survive conditions that would kill most of the species using the Academy. The proposal was approved with unusual speed, because nothing motivated bureaucratic efficiency like realizing your surveillance system couldn't surveil efficiently. And life continued, as it does in civilized space, which we're still using generously to mean places where people pretend the universe is safe. The human attended classes, studied xenobiology, made friends with species who were still processing the fact that she'd operated through pain that should have killed them while treating it as a minor inconvenience. She even joined the Academy's emergency response volunteer program, which seemed like either cosmic irony or possibly the universe's idea of a joke. The footage remained in the secure archive, classified and restricted, definitely not being reviewed by faculty members who wanted to understand what they were dealing with. Definitely not being analyzed by xenopsychologists trying to comprehend Deathworld species' relationship with pain and danger. Definitely not becoming a legend whispered among Academy staff about the time the cameras malfunctioned at exactly the right moment to avoid documenting something that would have required acknowledging that humans were terrifying. Dean Vorex kept a copy, encrypted and hidden, because some things were too important to leave to official archives. On nights when his eye stalks couldn't sleep, he'd watch it again, studying the human's casual competence in conditions that represented his species' nightmare scenario. He'd watch her check on her classmates while her hands were burned, watch her breathe toxic air while organizing triage, watch her treat a crisis that would have sent Velcrians into permanent psychological trauma as just another problem to solve. And he'd think about the 463 cameras that had captured it all, the obsessive documentation that was supposed to make everything safe and controlled. The surveillance state built on the assumption that if you recorded everything, you could prevent anything bad from happening. All that technology, all that policy, all that careful protocol, and it had taken one human student approximately 4 seconds to demonstrate that the universe didn't care about safety procedures or documented risk assessments or properly filed emergency protocols. The cameras malfunctioned, the official report said. Equipment failure during emergency conditions. These things happened. But in the quiet of his office, with the secret footage playing on his secured terminal, Dean Vorex knew the truth. The cameras hadn't malfunctioned at all. They'd worked perfectly, recording everything with crystal clarity, capturing every detail of the moment a Deathworld species had looked at a situation that should have been impossible to survive, and decided it was merely inconvenient. The cameras had malfunctioned only in the sense that they'd revealed something the galactic community preferred not to acknowledge. That all their safety protocols, all their careful documentation, all their obsessive recording of everything, couldn't change the fact that the universe contained species that operated on entirely different assumptions about what was survivable. The footage stayed archived. The human stayed enrolled. The Academy continued its surveillance, now with better cameras that could survive conditions that would kill most of their users. And somewhere in the vast documentation databases of civilized space, there was not a record, definitely not, officially absolutely not, of the day a Deathworld student taught an entire institution that sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't what the cameras catch, but what you have to pretend they didn't. The human graduated 2 years later with honors in xenobiology, a specialty in crisis response, and a reputation among the faculty as that student we don't talk about during incident reviews. She sent a very polite thank you note to the Academy, praising their excellent medical facilities and emergency response training, completely unaware that her mere presence had triggered a minor existential crisis among the administration. The cameras continued recording everything, as they always had. Better cameras now, more advanced, capable of documenting conditions that would have seemed impossible before a human decided that impossible was just a suggestion. And if occasionally the footage developed mysterious malfunctions during particularly interesting moments, well, equipment failure was just part of maintaining a safe and properly documented educational environment. After all, some things were too important to be captured on camera, and some truths were too dangerous to be properly archived. The Velcrian Academy had learned this lesson the hard way, through 463 camera angles and one very determined Deathworld student who thought second-degree burns were a reasonable price for solving a problem. The universe, as always, had the last laugh. Because in a cosmos obsessed with documentation and surveillance, sometimes the most important moments were the ones that official records claimed had never been properly recorded at all. The cameras had malfunctioned. The equipment had failed. These things happened, and everyone involved maintained this fiction with the dedication that only truly scared species could achieve, because the alternative was admitting what they'd learned, that humans were exactly as terrifying as the Deathworld classification suggested, just in ways that were much harder to document and far more polite than anyone had expected. Somewhere in restricted archives, encrypted and classified, the footage remained. A monument to the day the surveillance state discovered that some truths were too uncomfortable to acknowledge, even when recorded from 17 different angles in multiple spectrums with full atmospheric analysis. But officially, the cameras had malfunctioned, and that was exactly how everyone preferred it.